In more than half a century of artistic work, James Brolin has built a persistent career that few people can maintain for so long in Hollywood. He started from small roles on television, but the real turning point came when he took on the role of Dr. Stephen Kiley in the series Marcus Welby, MD, a role that not only made him a familiar face to American audiences, but also brought him a Primetime Emmy Award and a Golden Globe Award, important milestones that confirmed his talent in the early stage of his career. Not stopping at television, he continued to expand into film with notable movies like Westworld and Capricorn One, showing his ability to adapt and transform across different genres. He also took on the roles of director and producer, contributing behind the scenes to the success of many major television projects. With more than 100 roles spanning many decades, he not only existed but also maintained a stable position in a harsh industry where most actors disappear after just a few years. But behind all those achievements was a journey that was not at all complete, where what he achieved did not always come with inner satisfaction. Success came, but it was not big enough to put him in the top tier of stars, and that created a hard-to-name silence, where he always stood between two worlds, not a failure, but also never truly a winner. His first marriage broke up in silence, leaving long cracks in the family, and a difficult-to-mend distance with Josh Brolin, the son who later became a bigger name than his own. There were losses that could not be returned, words that were never spoken, and moments when he was forced to face himself in prolonged silence. But even without a brilliant victory, he still continued to move forward, still worked, still existed in a world that was always changing, carrying within himself not perfection but a quiet will, a decision that did not disappear, even when no one really saw it. Before we move forward into the story of the man who lived his whole life in that silence, please hit like and subscribe to the channel to show appreciation for a life that was not loud but never stopped. If most people believe that a quiet life usually begins from a peaceful childhood, then for James Brolin, that quietness took a different form of stillness, not because of fullness, but because of the lack of connections a child needs to feel he belongs somewhere. He grew up in Los Angeles, in a city that was always moving, where dreams were lit every day and also faded every day. But inside his own house, there was not much sound like that. His family was not poor, did not struggle with hunger or obvious hardships, but it lacked something more important: closeness, listening, and the feeling of being seen as a separate person. His father was a strict man who believed in discipline more than affection, and in his world expressing emotions seemed unnecessary. There were no words of encouragement, no hugs, only silent standards that a child had to understand and meet on his own. From early on, James learned that silence was the safest way to exist, not because he had nothing to say, but because he was not sure if anyone was really listening. At school, he was not the standout child, not the top of the class, and not the center of conversations. He existed like a shadow, always present but rarely noticed. Other children could be loud, could make mistakes, could be forgiven, while he chose to step back, observe, and keep everything inside. Gradually, that silence was no longer a choice, but became part of who he was. A protective shell he never truly removed. There were afternoons after school when other children gathered, laughed, and shared their small stories, while he quietly walked home, carrying the feeling that he was stepping out of a world he had never really belonged to. No one called his name in the games, no one waited for him at the school gate, and over time he stopped expecting it to. The waiting gradually disappeared, replaced by a quiet acceptance that perhaps his role in this life was not to be seen, but only to exist long enough not to be completely forgotten. But in that silence there were still private worlds he created for himself. He found comfort in cinema, in stories told on the screen, where people could become anyone, live any life, and be listened to in ways real life did not always provide. When the lights in the theater went out and the screen lit up, He was no longer the boy standing on the side, but part of the story. Someone who could feel, could understand, and could exist in a clearer way. The characters on screen did not know who he was, but he felt he understood them more than anyone around him. Besides cinema, he was also drawn to machines, to things that could be taken apart and put back together. Structures with clear logic, where everything had its reason for existing. He spent hours observing, learning how things worked, as if trying to find an order that human life could not provide. Machines did not judge, did not stay silent in a painful way, did not create invisible distance. They simply existed and responded to what he did, and in that world he no longer felt like an extra. There was a feeling that followed him through those years, a feeling hard to name but always present. The feeling of standing outside life, looking into other people's worlds without truly stepping in. He saw other families laughing and talking, saw other children being hugged, being called by name, being recognized. And though he did not say it, he understood that he was missing something no one explained to him. There was no big event in his childhood, no specific moment that marked a change, but that prolonged absence quietly shaped who he was, in a way no one noticed. He did not rebel, did not resist, did not try to break the limits around him. Instead, he learned to adapt, learned to exist in silence, and learned to keep everything inside. What no one realized at the time was that the silence did not disappear when he grew up. It went with him, seeped into every choice, every relationship, every step in the life that followed. And when looking back, perhaps the most painful thing was not that he lacked something in the past, but that he learned to live without a way of living that kept him from collapsing, but also never let him feel truly whole. As if from the early years of life he had been shaped to become someone who was always present, but rarely truly seen. The silence that James Brolin learned from his childhood years did not disappear when he became an adult. It only changed form, sneaking into the biggest decisions of his life, especially when he chose to step into a world built on attention, recognition, and voice, a world that seemed completely opposite to who he was. There was no clear moment that made him decide to become an actor, no affirmation that this was the right path, only a vague feeling that if he did not try he would forever stand outside, watching other people's lives happen without ever truly participating in them. But even after stepping onto that path, he still carried the hesitation, the self-doubt that had taken root from childhood, like someone trying to enter a crowded room without being sure he was invited. The first years were a long chain of unsuccessful auditions, times of waiting, then leaving in silence, and glances that passed over him without stopping. He was not the most standout person in the room, not someone whose presence made others notice immediately. He was just another face in a long line of people trying to be chosen, and in an industry where hundreds competed for one small chance that almost meant being forgotten. There were days he stood in narrow hallways, heard other names called, heard doors close behind them, and wondered if anyone inside that room even remembered he had stood there. To survive, he did whatever was necessary. Small jobs, nameless roles, brief appearances that audiences did not even have time to notice. Life did not give him many choices, and he did not allow himself the right to quit. But that existence did not always bring the feeling of moving forward. There were long periods when everything seemed to stand still, where he worked nonstop but did not get closer to anything clear. Hollywood, with all the lights and opportunities people often talked about, felt to him like a place where doors always opened, but never for him. The feeling of not belonging here became clearer over time. He watched others enter the industry with confidence, with connections, with a certainty he had never had. They talked easily, laughed loudly, took up space as if it was natural, while he still stood on the edge, observing, trying to understand how this world worked without ever truly becoming part of it. There were moments he wondered if he was trying to become something he was not suited for, if this dream really belonged to him, or was just another way for him to keep standing outside his real life. The long nights became the only place he faced himself. No more lights, no more voices, only the familiar silence from childhood. But this time, it was heavier. He lay there, looking up at the ceiling, wondering if all these efforts meant anything, if there would be a day when everything would change, or if he would continue living like this, always trying but never enough. Those questions had no answers, and perhaps what made them more frightening was that he began to get used to them, as if doubt had become an inseparable part of who he was. But amid all of that there was still one thing that did not disappear. The dream, not a clear dream, not an image of fame or success, but only a feeling that something was waiting for him, that his life had not ended in those narrow hallways and closed doors. Sometimes that dream was very fragile, almost disappearing on the worst days, but it never completely left him. It existed like a thin thread, holding him there, pulling him to keep moving forward, even when there was no evidence that the road ahead would lead anywhere. He was not someone who pursued the dream with bright confidence, not someone who was sure he would succeed. He was only a person who did not know what else to do except continue. And perhaps that was exactly what defined his path more than any talent or opportunity: a quiet persistence, a decision repeated every day that he would not stop, even when no one was looking, even when no one was waiting, and even when he himself was not sure where he was going. And then there were the years when even the most fragile dream began to feel like a luxury for James Brolin, when the efforts no longer brought any sign of progress, and everything seemed to repeat in such a tiring way that he could no longer tell how today was different from yesterday. He still went to auditions, still stood in the familiar hallways, still waited for the rare nods, but the results did not change. The roles that came to him were so small that people did not remember the character's name. Sometimes they did not even remember that he had appeared. He showed up, did his part, then disappeared from the screen as if he had never existed. And the most painful thing was not being rejected, but being chosen. Yet no one really noticed. Those years did not have one big fall, did not have one clear moment of collapse, but a slow erosion, bit by bit, as if life was gradually taking everything away without needing to destroy him right away. He watched people who once stood beside him in auditions begin to make clear progress, watched them appear on screen more often, get mentioned more often, get recognized in ways he had never reached. Some names that were once unfamiliar became familiar to audiences while he stayed in the same place, not moving forward and not completely falling behind, just stuck in a space where time seemed to have no meaning. The feeling of being stuck did not come from a single failure, but from the lack of any sign that things would change. He still worked, still appeared, still tried, but nothing accumulated into a clear step forward. His life did not stop, but it also did not go anywhere. There were evenings when he sat alone, trying to remember the last time he felt he was moving forward, and the answer was usually a vague emptiness he could not identify. In those moments, the thought of giving up began to appear, not as a strong decision, but as a repeated whisper in his head. It did not shout, did not push. It simply stayed there, waiting for him to be tired enough to listen. He wondered if he was wasting his time, if there was another life that was easier and clearer waiting. If he dared to step out of this path, maybe he could become someone else, do a different job, live a life with less uncertainty and less dependence on other people's acceptance. But every time that thought became clearer, he felt something pulling him back. Not faith, not certainty, but only a familiarity too deep to abandon. Inside him, two people began to exist side by side, and the distance between them grew larger. One person still continued to move forward, still went to auditions, still told himself that just one more time, one more chance, and everything might be different. The other person was tired, exhausted, no longer believed that anything good was waiting ahead, and began to see every effort as a loop with no ending. Those two people never really confronted each other, but they existed together, pulling him in two different directions, making every step heavier. There were days when the persistent one won, and he stepped out with a small bit of hope, enough to continue for one more day. But there were also days when the exhausted one took over, and he felt he was only repeating something that had lost meaning long ago. He did not talk to anyone about it, did not share with anyone, because from very early on he had learned that battles like this usually took place in silence. No one saw, no one intervened, and no one really understood the feeling when you were still trying, but no longer knew why you had to continue. Time passed without bringing answers, only bringing more days that were the same, more roles no one remembered, more evenings that felt longer than usual. And in all of that, what scared him the most was not failure, but the possibility that his life could pass like this, not collapsing, not exploding, just simply fading over time. An existence long enough not to be called failure, but also not clear enough to be called success. And in those years, James Brolin began to understand something no one had taught him, that sometimes the hardest thing was not starting, but continuing, when every sign showed that you were going the right way, but going nowhere. Then came a time when it seemed everything finally changed, not in a loud or sudden way, but like a door slowly opening after so many years of waiting in silence. When James Brolin was given the chance to step into a role in Marcus Welby, MD, a role that would later become the most important milestone in the early stage of his career. For the first time in many years, he was no longer a fleeting face that audiences forgot right after the episode ended, but became a familiar part of their lives, a character with a name, with a story, with a clear presence. Audiences began to recognize him, critics began to mention him, and the awards also came things he had only been able to watch from afar before. That was the moment many people would call success, the point where all the years of waiting were finally rewarded. But there was one thing no one saw, an emptiness that still existed even when the light shone on him. The success he achieved did not bring the feeling of completeness he had once imagined during the difficult years. It came, clear and specific, measurable by fame and awards, but it did not touch the deepest place inside him where he once thought everything would change when things finally went as expected. He worked more, appeared more, was mentioned more, but every time he returned to himself, he still felt something that had never truly been filled. Part of that came from the way the industry saw him. The role that brought success was also the thing that began to limit him. He was no longer unknown, but he was also not seen as an actor who could go beyond that image. He became a familiar face of television, someone audiences felt comfortable seeing, but not someone they expected to surprise them. The roles that came after began to carry the same color, as if he was repeating himself in different forms. And that made him realize that success was sometimes not a door opening to infinity, but a new room with different walls. He did not talk much about it, did not complain, did not resist. On the outside, everything seemed to be going in the right direction. He had stable work, recognition, things he had once longed for. But inside, the question remained, whether this was all or not. He watched other actors who could transform, who could change their image, who could be seen as true artists, and wondered if he was being kept in a version that others found easier to accept, but did not fully reflect who he was. That feeling did not come suddenly, but accumulated over time, like a slow realization that achieving what he had once wanted did not mean finding satisfaction. He had gotten the opportunity, he had gotten the position, but that did not automatically bring meaning to all the years before. There were evenings after finishing work, when everything around was quiet, when he returned to the familiar feeling, the feeling that he was still standing at some distance from his own life. Perhaps the hardest thing to accept was not that he had not achieved something, but that he had achieved it and still felt lacking. That made him begin to look back not only at his career, but also at what he had sacrificed to get here. Time, relationships, moments he had missed while chasing something that no longer brought the feeling he had once imagined. Success was not wrong. It was just not enough to change the things deep inside him. And then, while the world looked at him as someone who had finally found his place, James Brolin began to understand that there were journeys that did not end when you reached a destination but simply shifted into another form where you no longer tried to be seen but began to try to understand whether what you had become was really what you had once been looking for. And while on the outside everything seemed to finally be going in the right direction, somewhere else, very close but easy to overlook, James Brolin's personal life began to turn onto a path that even he did not realize until it was too late. His marriage to Jane Cameron, AG, began at a time when both of them believed the future still held so many things ahead, when dreams were still intact and had not been worn down by time or pressure. They came together not because of fame or status, but because of a simpler feeling: the need to have someone beside them, the need to have a place to return to after long days when the outside world was not always kind. In the early years, everything seemed good enough to believe they could build a lasting life. There were peaceful moments, ordinary days that were still enough to make one feel okay. But then, just like the way his career developed, not loudly, but with clearer steps, the distance between them also began to form in a similar way. Not suddenly, not violently, but slowly, almost impossible to notice in each individual day. As work began to take up more time, the times away from home became more frequent, and the conversations that had once been a natural part of life gradually became rare. There was no big argument that marked the change, no specific event that made everything collapse. Instead, there were longer and longer silences, questions that were not asked, answers that were no longer expected. Two people still lived in the same space, but seemed to exist in two different worlds. He carried the pressures of work, of maintaining a career that had just begun to find its footing, while Jane stayed with the emptiness his absence left behind: long days with no one to share them, evenings with no one to listen. There were relationships that did not break because of big things, but because of small things repeated too many times. A missed call, coming home late one evening, forgetting to ask how someone was, and gradually those things accumulated into a distance that no one really knew how to close. He was not someone who deliberately pulled away, but he also did not realize that he was gradually disappearing from the other person's life. Each day that passed, he believed he was doing what was necessary: working, building a career, creating a more stable foundation for the family. But what he did not see was what was gradually being lost in the process. The pressure of work and family responsibility began to overlap in a way he could not balance. When he was at home, his mind was still somewhere else, still busy with plans, worries, things not yet finished. When he was at work, he carried the feeling that something at home was slowly slipping out of his reach. But instead of facing that, he chose to continue, to keep working, to keep believing that everything would be okay once he reached some level of stability. Only that level of stability never came at the right time. When he began to realize that the conversations were no longer like before, that the closeness had become awkward, then everything had changed too much to go back to the way it was. There was a silence between them, not the familiar silence he had known from childhood, but a heavier silence carrying things left unsaid, emotions held back, and a distance that both felt but neither knew where to begin to fill. What made everything hard to notice was that there was no clear sign of collapse. They were still there, still continued their lives, still performed their roles in a way that outsiders might think was normal. But inside, the affection was no longer the same, and the scariest thing was that both seemed to have gotten used to it. The cooling did not come like a storm, but like a long winter where everything gradually lost its vitality without anyone noticing when it began. And then, when looking back, the most painful thing was not losing a relationship, but realizing that it had been lost long before he had time to notice. He did not lose it in one moment, but in hundreds of small moments he had not paid attention to, in the days he chose work instead of staying, in the times he thought he still had time to fix things. But time did not wait, and there were things that once passed would never come back the way one wanted. In all the successes he achieved on the outside, there was one thing gradually disappearing inside that he could not hold on to. And when he finally realized that, James Brolin no longer stood before a choice, but only faced one truth: that the most important things in life did not disappear because of one big mistake, but because too many small things were overlooked until all that remained was an emptiness no one could fill. And then, when all the silences had stretched long enough that they could no longer be pretended away, James Brolin's marriage ended in a way that even he could not clearly name. There was no fierce argument, no accusations spoken in anger, no single moment when everything shattered into pieces. Instead, it ended in silence, a silence that had stretched from long before, now simply becoming an irreversible truth. Two people who had once shared the same roof and the same early hopes now stood before each other with nothing left to say, as if every word that needed to be spoken had been missed many years earlier. The divorce happened not like a battle, but like a letting go. No one won, no one lost, only a relationship that had reached the point where continuing no longer had meaning. And perhaps that was exactly what made it hurt more, because there was nothing to hold on to. No clear cause to blame, only a chain of days and months when the two of them gradually drifted apart without realizing they were heading in different directions. To the outside world, it was just another divorce like so many others in the entertainment industry. But for him, it was the collapse of a part of his life that he had once believed he could preserve. The children did not understand everything that was happening, but they felt the change. The atmosphere in the house was no longer the same. Familiar things began to disappear, and a quiet separation appeared in their lives. There was no specific moment when they were sat down and given a full explanation, only small changes that gradually accumulated into a new reality, that the family they had once known no longer existed in the old way. And in that change, Josh Brolin and his other children had to learn to adapt to a world where their parents were no longer in the same place, no longer sharing the same life. For him, the feeling of failure did not come from any outside criticism, but from the silence inside. He was not the one abandoned, nor the one who clearly chose to leave. But he knew that he had not kept what he should have kept. The role of a husband was not something that could be measured by success or fame, and in that area he had no awards, no recognition, only an emptiness he had to face on his own. Some people get the chance to fix their mistakes right when they happen, but for him, everything happened too slowly to notice and too late to change. When he began to see clearly what had been lost, it was no longer there for him to hold on to. There was no chance to go back to the early days, no way to recover the conversations that never happened, the moments that had been missed. The only thing left was memory fragments of memory that he could look back on but could not change. That ending did not bring a feeling of release, but only left a prolonged emptiness. He continued to work, continued to appear, continued to live as if everything was still going on normally, but inside a part of him had changed, not in a sudden way, but in a quieter way, as if he had lost something he could not name, but felt clearly every day. Some endings close one chapter and open another, but there are also endings that simply end. No new beginning right away, no clear direction, only a period when he had to learn to live with what had happened. And in that period he began to understand that there were things in life that could not be fixed by effort, could not be changed by willpower, because they were not broken in one moment, but eroded over time. The divorce was not a clear ending point in the eyes of others, but for James Brolin it was a milestone he could not go back before. An invisible line between what had once been and what no longer was. And even though he continued to move forward, continued to live, continued to build other things in his life, the truth remained that there were losses that did not need to be loud to become deep. And there were days when a man could lose his family without any battle taking place. After everything ended in that quiet way, James Brolin's life did not stop, but some things had changed permanently, especially the way he existed in the life of his child. If before the distance between him and his family had gradually formed without him noticing, now that distance became clearer than ever, no longer hidden by the habit of living together, no longer blurred by busy days and months. It existed as a truth he was forced to face every time he thought about Josh Brolin and the years when he had not really been there in the way a father needed to be. He did not abandon his child in a sudden way, did not disappear completely from his child's life, but his presence was not enough to fill the emptiness that the years of absence had created. There were important moments in Josh's youth that he did not witness, stages when his son had to go through them on his own without guidance, without a hand close enough to hold on when things began to go off course. And what tormented him was not that he did not love his child, but that love was not enough to turn into real presence. Josh grew up with complex emotions that could not always be expressed in words. When he was young, the distance could be just a vague feeling, an unclear absence, but when he stepped into adulthood, those things began to become clearer. The wrong decisions, the rebellious stages, the times of being lost did not come from a single cause, but from many overlapping factors. And in all of that, the absence of a father was probably a part that could not be denied. James Brolin watched his son go through difficult stages with a feeling he did not know what to call a combination of worry, regret, and helplessness. He wanted to help, wanted to intervene, wanted to say something that could change his son's direction. But each time he realized there was an invisible distance between them, a distance that could not be crossed by intention alone. Not because Josh did not need him, but because the relationship between them had never been built solidly enough for those words to reach where they needed to. There were conversations that took place but were not deep enough. There were meetings but not close enough. They were not complete strangers, but also did not truly understand each other in the way a father and son usually do. The affection was still there, did not disappear, was not destroyed, but it existed as something unfinished, a bond that had never been fully developed, and now had to exist with all its limits. The hardest thing was not seeing his child in difficulty, but realizing that he did not have the position to intervene in the way he wanted. He could not go back to the years before to do things differently, could not rebuild from the beginning what had not been built at the right time. The role of a father was not something that could be relearned from the start when everything had gone too far, and that became a truth he had to accept, whether he wanted to or not. There were nights he thought about that, not with blame or self-punishment, but with a slow understanding that life does not always give us the chance to fix things at the right time. He had done what he thought was necessary at that moment, had pursued his career with everything he had, but the price of those choices was not always clear when they were made. It only became clear later, when everything had taken shape, when relationships had developed in their own way, and when what had been missing could no longer be fully supplemented. Even so, he did not completely disappear from his child's life. There were efforts, there were attempts to get closer, to understand more, to be not just a name or a familiar face, but a father in the way he could. But those efforts always carried a limit, a hesitation that both felt. No one said it out loud, but both understood that there were things that had not happened at the right time, and now could only be fixed partially, never completely. And in all of that, James Brolin began to understand that love is not always enough to hold a relationship together. There are things that need more than that presence. Time, connection things, that if not there at the right moment will leave an emptiness that nothing can completely fill. He was still Josh's father, and that would never change. But the way that role was carried out had been shaped by the past, by what had happened and what had not happened. And perhaps what troubled him the most was not what he had lost, but the understanding that there were parts of his life, the most important parts, that could not be started over, could not be rewritten, only continued with everything that was still missing. Like a father standing at a distance not too far, but also never close enough. And then there came a day when he thought that what had passed could be kept as distant memories, no longer close enough to hurt more. When the news arrived, quiet but heavy, like something he had never prepared to face. Jane Cameron, AG, had passed away, not in a circumstance where he could be there, not in a moment where he could say a final word, but as news that came after everything, when everything had ended long ago but the emotions had never truly left. For James Brolin, that was not only the departure of someone he had once been connected to, but the permanent closing of a part of his life that he had never fully understood, never fully repaired. There are losses that come when everything is still unfinished, and that is exactly what makes them harder to accept. If a relationship ends with clarity, with words that have been spoken, with things that have been resolved, then perhaps people can find some form of peace. But for him, there was none of that. What remained were the gaps, conversations that never happened, apologies that were never said, moments when he had thought he still had time to come back, and now all of that could no longer be changed. The news did not cause an explosive reaction, did not make him collapse in a way others could see. It came and stayed, quietly but persistently, like a weight he carried that he could not put down. He could not go back to the past, could not change the choices that had brought him here, and that became a truth he had to learn to accept, even if he never truly understood it. When looking back at his marriage, he no longer saw it as a chain of events, but as a timeline of things that had not happened. Not the arguments, not the conflicts, but the moments that could have been different. The evenings he could have stayed instead of leaving, the times he could have listened more instead of staying silent, the moments he could have realized sooner that the most important thing was not what he was building outside, but what he was gradually losing inside. There is a feeling hard to name when a person realizes they have lost something they will never have the chance to get back. Not a sharp pain, but a prolonged heaviness, an awareness that a part of their life has closed in an incomplete way. Jane was no longer there for him to say anything. No chance to do it over. No way to turn thoughts into actions. All that remained was memory, and memory cannot be changed, cannot respond, can only exist as a constant reminder of what had passed. He did not talk much about it, did not share it with the world, because there are pains that do not need to be put into words to exist. It was there in the quiet moments, in the times he paused a little longer when thinking about the past, in the thoughts that appeared unexpectedly and that he could not control. There were nights when silence was no longer the refuge it had once been, but became the place where everything returned. The images, the memories, the questions without answers. What tormented him was not that the marriage had ended, but the way it had ended, without clarity, without real closure. And now that Jane was gone, that closure would never happen. There are stories in human life that have no proper ending, only a stopping point after which people have to carry everything that remains on their own. For James Brolin, this loss was not only the departure of one person, but the disappearance of a part of himself, a part tied to the years he had lived, had loved, had made mistakes and had not realized it in time. And in all the things he had been through, perhaps this was the only thing he could do. Nothing about except. No fixing, no changing, no redoing. Only silence. A silence different from everything he had known before, because this time it was no longer a choice but the only thing left. And in that silence he continued to live, continued to move forward, carrying a part of the past that no one saw but was always present, like an emptiness that was never filled, like a reminder that there are things in life that do not disappear in one moment but stay forever, only changing form over time. After everything that had happened, after the losses that could not be repaired and the gaps that could not be filled, James Brolin still continued to live, continued to work, continued to appear, but in a different way, quieter, with fewer expectations, like a person who had understood that not every journey leads to the peak that people once imagined. His career did not stop, and even remained stable in a way many people could dream of. He still had roles, was still invited to projects, still maintained his position in an industry known for being harsh and quick to forget. But that stability did not mean he reached a clear peak, did not make him the first name mentioned when people talked about the big stars of Hollywood. There is a very subtle difference between existing and being remembered, and he seemed to stand on the boundary between the two. He did not disappear, was not eliminated, but also never truly occupied the center. The films he joined could succeed, the roles he took could be solid, but when the lights went out, when the story ended, he was often not the one who stayed longest in the audience's mind. That did not come from a lack of ability, but from the way this industry worked, where only a few are pushed forward, while most others, no matter how talented, exist in the background, keeping everything running but rarely seen clearly. Over time, that feeling was no longer something he struggled with or tried to change. It became part of the reality he gradually accepted. He watched new generations of actors appear, young faces noticed right from their first roles, and realized that his path had never been like theirs. He had no explosive moment, no role that defined his entire career in a way people could easily mention. Instead, he had a long chain of roles, years of non-stop work, creating a persistent but quiet presence. The feeling of living in the shadow came not only from the industry but also from his personal life. As Josh Brolin gradually became a big name, achieving iconic roles and wide recognition, a quiet shift took place. Not everyone noticed, but he did. He did not feel jealous, did not feel threatened, but there was something hard to name when a father watched his son achieve what he himself had never reached. Not a clear sadness, but a deep awareness that life had gone in a direction he could not change, and that his role now was no longer the leader, but the one standing behind, observing and accepting. There were moments he wondered whether he had been recognized enough, whether what he had done was enough to be remembered. But those questions no longer carried the same urgency as before. They were only passing thoughts that came and went without leaving many traces. Because at some point he had understood that recognition was not always within a person's control, and that there were lives built not to be mentioned the most, but to last the longest. He continued to work, but no longer with the same expectations as before. No more pressure to prove anything, no more need to reach a specific milestone. Work became a natural part of life, not something that defined his entire self. There was a lightness in that, but also an emptiness, because when you no longer pursue anything, you also have to face the question of where you are going. The acceptance came not as a decision, but as a process. He did not wake up one day and decide he would be content with his current position. Instead, he gradually understood that his life had followed this path for a very long time, and that fighting against it no longer had meaning. There was a certain peace in acceptance, but it was not complete peace. Only a kind of balance between what he had and what he had not achieved. And in all of that, James Brolin became a man standing in the shadow of his own life, not completely obscured, but also never fully stepping into the light. He did not disappear, was not completely forgotten, but also was not the person the world stopped to look at for long. A persistent, quiet existence that stretched through the years, where value did not lie in being seen the most, but in still being there, still continuing, even when no one was really waiting anymore. And then, when everything in life seemed to have passed the points that people usually call the most important: career, marriage, family, loss, James Brolin stepped into a stage where he no longer searched for anything grand, no longer pursued the old definitions of success or happiness. It was precisely in that period, when all expectations had settled down and what remained was only his true self, that he met Barbara Streisand, the person who had also gone through wounds, breakups, and years when the stage lights could not hide the loneliness behind them. Their meeting did not carry the color of a brilliant love story, was not an explosion of emotions, or a beginning that made the world pay attention. It happened in an ordinary way, almost quietly, But that very ordinariness was what both of them needed at that time. They did not come to each other to fill a gap immediately, but came to each other as two people who had understood that those gaps could not be erased completely. The only thing they could do was learn to live with them without letting them destroy what was left. Their relationship was not built on expectations of perfection, because both knew clearly that perfection did not exist. They did not try to become the best version of themselves to please the other, but simply allowed themselves to be who they were, with everything that had happened, with the unfinished parts, with the memories that no one could erase. And perhaps that was exactly what created a form of connection they had not had before, understanding that did not need too many words, an acceptance that did not demand change. No more races against time, no more pressure to prove anything to the world. Their shared life carried a different rhythm, slower, quieter, and somewhat separate from the noise both had once been familiar with. They chose to live away from the lights, not because they were no longer noticed, but because they no longer needed that. Evenings were no longer taken over by work or parties, but replaced by simple moments being with each other, without needing to say much, without needing to play any role. For James Brolin, this was not a new beginning in the traditional sense, because he understood that nothing truly started over from the beginning. What had happened was still there, still a part of him. And this relationship did not erase those things, but it brought something else, a feeling of stability he had never had before, a place where he did not need to try to become a different version of himself. They did not avoid differences, did not always agree with each other. But the important thing was that they no longer saw those differences as a threat. After everything they had been through, they understood that a relationship is not kept by eliminating every conflict, but by accepting that those conflicts will always exist. And instead of letting them break everything, they learned to go through them without losing each other. There was a peace in the way they existed together. But it was not a peace without a past. It was a peace built on looking straight at the past and accepting it, without trying to change it, without trying to forget it. For him, this love was not something that made everything perfect, but something that helped him understand that life did not need to be perfect to continue. In a world where everything is often measured by what can be seen, fame, success, attention, their relationship existed in a different way, without needing to prove anything, without needing to be recognized. And perhaps that was exactly what made it lasting. Not because it was stronger than what he had had before, but because it did not try to become anything other than itself. And when looking back, James Brolin did not see this as a completely new chapter, but as a continuation of goals that he stepped into with fewer illusions, fewer expectations, but with a deeper understanding of himself and of what a relationship truly needed to exist. Not perfection, not intensity, but acceptance. An acceptance large enough to keep two people together even when both knew they could not change what had happened before. And precisely in that somewhat fragile peace, when life was no longer pulled by ambitions or pressures to prove anything to the world, James Brolin began to face something he had avoided for many years: the role he had played in the lives of his children, and what had not happened the way it should have. There was no clear awakening moment, no event that forced him to change, but only a slow realization that if he did not do something differently, the distance between him and his family would remain forever the same. He started with very small things, almost unnoticeable to outsiders. More frequent calls, proactive appearances, conversations that were no longer rushed like before. He did not try to impose, did not try to control or direct in the way he once thought was right, but instead learned to listen, a thing that seemed simple but was not easy for someone who had grown used to keeping everything inside. Listening was not only hearing what was said, but accepting that there were things he could not fully understand, that his children had gone through things he had not been there to witness. The relationship with Josh Brolin and his other children did not change immediately. There was no moment when everything suddenly became good, no words that could erase the years that had passed. Instead, it was a long process where each small step was built on patience and an unspoken acknowledgement that the past could not be erased. There were conversations that were still awkward, there were silences that still existed, but they were no longer as heavy as before, no longer signs of complete distance but only part of the journey both sides were trying to go through. He did not try to become a perfect father because he understood that was no longer possible. What he could do was be present in the way he had not been able to before, being there when needed, listening when something was shared, and more importantly, not walking away when things became difficult. Those were not grand actions, but the things he had missed before. And now they became the foundation to rebuild what could still be rebuilt. There were times he realized that trust was not something that could be demanded, but had to be rebuilt from the beginning, little by little. Each appearance, each time he kept his word, each time he did not withdraw when there was a chance, he was trying to prove one thing, not to the world, but to his own family, that he had changed. Even though that change came late, but even when those efforts began to have meaning, he could not avoid the feeling that there were parts of the relationship that had never been formed properly, and therefore there would always be a limit he could not cross. The feeling of redemption was never completely whole because there was no way to go back and redo the years that had passed. He could do better in the present, could try harder, but that did not change the truth that there were moments that had been lost forever. And perhaps the hardest thing was not accepting that, but continuing to try even knowing the result would never be perfect. But he still continued, not because he believed everything would become whole, but because he understood that doing nothing would make that distance fixed forever. There was a different persistence in these efforts. Not the persistence of youth when he pursued his career, but a quieter, deeper kind of persistence, where the drive did not come from ambition, but from a simple desire not to let everything end the way it once had. In the rare moments when everything became lighter, when conversations flowed more naturally, when the distance seemed to narrow a little, he did not see that as a victory. He only saw it as a sign that what he was doing had meaning, however small. And perhaps those very small moments were what helped him continue, helped him believe that even though the past could not be changed, the present could still be lived in a different way. James Brolin did not become someone else, did not erase what had happened, but he had learned to stay in the relationships he had once walked away from, to stay in the conversations he had once avoided, and to stay with himself in a way he had never done before. And even though that journey did not bring a complete wholeness, it still brought something more important a chance, however small, not to repeat what had once happened and to live the rest of his life with an understanding that had taken him many years to gain. And then, when the efforts no longer pointed outward but gradually turned back inward, James Brolin stepped into a stage where time was no longer measured by opportunities or achievements, but by stillness and gaps long enough to think. His rhythm of life slowed down in an almost natural way, not because he was forced to stop, but because he no longer felt the need to run anymore. Mornings no longer began with a packed schedule. Days were no longer divided by appointments and roles that needed to be pursued. Instead, there was an emptiness he had never truly had before. An emptiness where he did not need to become anyone except himself. Fame, which had once been a goal, a measure, no longer held the same role as before. He no longer looked at what others achieved to compare, no longer wondered where he stood in a system he had spent his whole life trying to understand. Competition, which had once been unavoidable, now gradually disappeared from his thoughts like something belonging to a different stage, a different version of himself. That did not bring a feeling of victory, but only a lightness, as if he had finally set down a burden he had carried for too long without realizing it. But when everything on the outside settled down, what was inside became clearer. Time was no longer filled with work, and therefore it opened up gaps he could not avoid. He began to look back at his life not as a chain of events, but as a flow of choices that had brought him here with everything he had and everything he had lost. There were things he could look back on with a quiet satisfaction, not because they were perfect, but because he had not stopped, had not disappeared, had gone through each stage without completely losing himself. But there were also things that, whenever he thought about them, he could not avoid a heavy feeling. The incomplete relationships, the moments that had passed and could not be returned, the paths he had not chosen, all existed as unfinished parts of a picture he could only see clearly after having gone through nearly all of it. There was no intense torment, no destructive regret, but there was a quiet sense of sorrow, like an underlayer he could not completely erase. The peace he found in this stage was not absolute peace. It did not come from everything being okay, but from no longer trying to change what had happened. He did not try to rewrite the past, did not try to imagine a different version of his life, but learned to look at it as it had unfolded, with everything that was right and everything that was not. And in that way of looking, there was an acceptance that gradually formed, not like a decision, but like a state he stepped into naturally. They were days he felt lighter, when what had passed no longer felt as heavy as before, when memories no longer carried so many questions. But there were also days when the past returned more clearly, when the gaps became more noticeable, when he wondered if everything could have been different. And perhaps that very alternation created his reality, an imperfect balance between peace and regret, between acceptance and thoughts that never completely disappear. He no longer searched for answers to all those questions, because he understood that not every question has an answer, and not every answer brings release. Instead, he learned to live with them as part of a life he could not separate from. And in that way of living, there was a maturity he did not have when he was young, an understanding that life is not a journey toward perfection, but a chain of experiences where each part leaves its mark. James Brolin no longer tried to become a better version of himself in the way he once understood, no longer set goals to prove anything to the world. Instead, he existed in a simpler way, like a person who had gone through long enough to understand that the value of a life lies not only in what is achieved, but also in the way one lives with what has not been achieved. And in the stillness of the later years, he did not find a clear conclusion, but only found a status state where he no longer ran from the past, no longer tried to change it, but simply accepted that this was his life with everything it had, and had never become. And when the years had passed long enough for all the noise on the outside to settle down, what remained with James Brolin was not what the world saw, but the thoughts he had never spoken out loud, things that were not shared, not explained, but still existed as an inseparable part of who he was. There were emotions that could not find a way to be expressed, not because they were not important enough, but because he had grown used to keeping them inside long before he understood that they would follow him for the rest of his life. Those thoughts did not come all at once, did not explode, but appeared in individual moments, when he sat alone, when he looked back at a stage that had passed, or when a memory suddenly returned without invitation. There was a feeling that had followed him throughout his life, a feeling he rarely named but always recognized, the feeling that he had never truly been enough, not enough to be the most standout, not enough to keep everything intact, not enough to fill the gaps in the relationships he had once thought would always be there. That feeling did not make him stop, did not make him give up, but it was always there in the background, like a small voice he could not completely turn off. It did not say that he had failed, but only reminded him that there was something in his life that was always missing, always incomplete in the way he had once wanted, even when he had family beside him. When life was no longer as chaotic as before, loneliness still existed in its own way. It was not the loneliness of having no one around, but the loneliness of not being able to share everything he felt. There were things he did not say out loud, not because there was no one to say them to, but because he was not sure they could be understood in the way he experienced them. And over time, that silence became a part of him, no longer a burden, but also never completely gone. When looking back at the decisions that had shaped his life, he did not try to divide them into right or wrong, because he understood that each choice had been made in a specific circumstance with the understanding he had at that time. But that did not stop him from wondering whether there were other paths he had not chosen, other directions that might have led to a different life. Those questions did not carry intense regret, but only a quiet reflection, like a person looking back at a journey he had traveled without being able to return to any segment. There were parts of his life that he had to learn to accept without needing to understand everything. The losses, the gaps, the things that never became whole did not disappear with time, but only changed the way they existed. They were no longer as sharp as before, but were still there like an underlayer he could not remove. And in that acceptance there was an imperfect kind of peace apiece that did not come from everything being okay, but from no longer fighting against what had happened. Living with what was unfinished was not easy, but he had done that throughout his life in a way few people noticed. There were no grand declarations, no sudden changes, only a continuation, continuing to live, continuing to work, continuing to exist with everything he carried, and perhaps that had become an important part of who he was. The ability not to need to be perfect in order to keep going. The ability not to need to have everything in order to keep moving forward. James Brolin did not find a final answer for his life, did not reach a state where everything was clear, but he had arrived at a place where he could look at everything that had passed without needing to change it, without needing to make it different, and in the silence he had carried from the very first days he no longer tried to escape it, but accepted it as a part of himself, a part that had been there from the beginning, and would stay until the end. And when all the questions gradually settled down, when the unfinished things no longer made him try to find solutions, James Brolin's life appeared not as a story of victory or failure, but as a long journey of existence, a journey that was not loud, not brilliant, but also never disappeared. From the childhood years in Los Angeles, where he learned silence because of a lack of emotional connection, to the early years stepping into Hollywood with the feeling of not belonging, then the long years of being forgotten, the successes that came late but did not bring completeness, a marriage that broke apart in silence, the distance with his children, the losses that could not be repaired, and finally the acceptance in the later years, all created a life without a clear straight line, but a chain of turns where each segment left its own mark. He was not the person who achieved the most brilliant success in his generation. His name was not the first one mentioned when people talked about the great icons of cinema. He did not have a single role that defined his entire career, did not have a moment when the whole world stopped to look toward him. But at the same time, he was also not a failure. He did not disappear after a few years, was not completely forgotten, did not lose himself in the most difficult stages. He continued to work, continued to exist, continued to go through each stage without abandoning the path he had chosen, even when that path did not lead to where he had once imagined. There is a form of strength in continuing without needing to win, a form of persistence that is not mentioned much because it does not create dramatic stories, does not bring memorable moments in the way people usually look for. But that very persistence defined his life more than any specific achievement. He did not need to be the best to prove his value, did not need to stand in the center to exist. He only needed not to stop, and that, over time, became the most important thing. The legacy he left behind did not lie in numbers, did not lie in awards or roles that were mentioned many times. It lay in the endurance, in the fact that he had gone through everything life put in front of him without completely losing himself. He had gone through losses without letting them destroy him, had faced mistakes without letting them define his entire life, and had learned to live with what was unfinished without trying to deny it. In a world that always honors peaks, his story lay somewhere else, in the ability to exist between the silences, in keeping himself when things did not happen the way people expected. Perhaps what is most memorable about James Brolin is not what he achieved, but the way he went through his life, not with leaps but with steady steps, not with explosive moments, but with a continuous presence. He did not become an icon in the traditional sense, but he also never disappeared from Hollywood's story, never completely left the place where he had spent his whole life trying to belong. And when looking back, there may not be a clear conclusion. There may not be a simple answer to whether his life was a success or not. But one thing cannot be denied. He was there from beginning to end, without leaving, without disappearing, without giving up. In a world where many people come and go very quickly, his prolonged presence by itself was already something rare, not a resounding victory, but a form of enduring existence that not everyone can achieve. There are people remembered for what they conquered. There are people remembered for what they lost. And there are also people remembered for the way they continued even without any guarantee that continuing would lead to a clear result. He belonged to the third group, those who did not have a perfect story, did not have a complete journey, but still reached the end of their path without disappearing. And perhaps in all that his life had given and taken away, the most important thing was not whether he had won or lost, but that he had not stopped. James Brolin did not become the person the world always looked toward, but he also never became the person left completely behind. He stood in a place in between. Not brilliant, not dark, just simply still there, still existing, still continuing until there was nothing left to continue. James Brolin's story does not overwhelm people with brilliant peaks, but makes them pause because of the long gaps that stretched throughout a lifetime. The most painful thing was not that he failed, but that he had gone very far and still could not reach the feeling of completeness. From childhood in Los Angeles, where he learned to stay silent because of a lack of emotional connection, to the years of being forgotten in his career, then success with Marcus Welby, MD, but being boxed in, all showed a person who was always on the edge of his own life. The greatest tragedy did not lie in a single event, but in the way the most important things had passed quietly. The marriage with Jane that broke apart without sound, the distance with Josh Brolin that formed through the times of absence, and the regret that became permanent when he no longer had the chance to repair it after Jane's passing. Even when he found peace beside Barbra Streisand, it was not perfection but only a late healing. What makes this story worth treasuring is not what he achieved, but the way he did not disappear. He continued to work, continued to try to mend his family, continued to live even knowing that there were things that would never be whole. For American society, where success is often measured by fame and achievements, his life is a profound reminder that true value does not lie in how much you achieve, but in what you manage to keep: family, presence, and the ability to stay when things become difficult. If the story of James Brolin makes you think about the things you have missed in life, please hit subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a way to appreciate those who have quietly endured without disappearing. Thank you for staying until the end of this journey, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore imperfect lives but ones that have never stopped.